name is George Guglielmo. I am president of the Emilio Guglielmo Winery that was started by my grandfather here on property that he bought in 1925 in Morgan Hill, California. I grew up in Morgan Hill. Actually, in what are now our offices was the family home when Main Avenue was a dirt road, and there were prunes across the street, and all of Main Avenue all the way to town from here was all prunes. It's changed a little bit now. My grandfather and grandmother started the winery in 1925 during Prohibition, and then expanded the winery with the repeal of Prohibition. And then my father came into the business after World War II, 1945, with my mother, and I'm in the business today with two of my brothers. And we roughly bottle around 50,000 cases a year under our own label, and so we're proud to be part of the heritage of Morgan Hill, proud of the fact that I had grandparents who had the foresight to come here and create what we have today. You know, you had people like Paul Masson. You had people, I can't remember, Mirassou, French.
Pellier,
which is related to the Mirassou, I believe, family, and that brought varieties to California, and basically varieties from France that were at that time planted on rootstock that were resistant to phylloxera, which devastated the vineyards of Europe in the turn of the century. And the Italians basically brought more volume and varietal techniques, maybe, because the Italians drink a lot of wine, and with the influx of immigration from France, Italy, and Spain, there was definitely a resurgence of activity to produce wine that was part of these cultures' everyday experience. So I think a lot of vineyards were planted with varieties that tried to assimilate, maybe is that the word, to produce wines of a little bit better quality than just more simple red wines. That mission variety is probably what I would think that, which is still a few mission vineyards left. When I say mission, that is the variety of grape that we think the Spanish brought here. Oh. It's a heavily producer of wines, of grapes, and makes a lighter red wine. So the Italians, with the influx of immigration, probably infused a little bit more characteristic to the wines that were produced in Santa Clara Valley. That's what we're talking about. I really don't know, but you know, let's go back to my grandfather landed on Ellis Island on September 19th, 1909. Worked his way this way, mined in Indian Territory, eventually settling in San Francisco, and sent for my grandmother in November. Were married in San Francisco in November of 1910. He worked at a tannery. That's a picture of him there holding hide from the tannery to the wharf. And my grandmother worked at a French laundry ironing. And in 1925, bought the property down here. And I would imagine the reason they came this way is because they knew somebody that was from this area. And you have to remember, back at that time when those particular people from Italy came to the United States, Italy had just been unified. It's only been 150 years that Italy's been unified. So there were different dialects talked within the Italian culture itself. Coming from very, very northern part of Italy, the Piemonte area, that was another dialect. So they basically had those types of people that would stay closer together, as the Sicilians would stay together, Calabreses would stay together, Toscanos. So it was probably because somebody knew somebody that knew somebody that, and they were Piemontese that were down in this area. My grandfather wasn't a grape grower. He came here, he was a peasant in Italy. That's why he left Italy, because there was nothing there. They were in the northern part of Italy, so he came here to better his life with the intention, as a lot of them did, to go back after they reached their fortune. Which he did go back, but never to stay. But that wasn't until 1948, 49. So I think that may be what it is, and you have to remember, I have a picture back in the corner over there of a group of people that was taken probably in 1930. And that's in Gilroy. And that is the Piemonte Club. All those people were from the Piemonte area of Italy. So they spoke that dialect. So that's why I say, you know, that they had their little groups that stayed together, because the communication was and it's just your people. And so that's possibly why he came this way. And that's, yeah. And as far as, let's look at the logistics of growing grapes in St. Helena, growing grapes in Morgan Hill. If we look at it from a viticultural point of view, not back then, I'm looking at it today, we are almost identical weather-wise as St. Helena. So you couldn't have went to a better place to duplicate what St. Helena says they have. Okay, back then, of course, everything was picked by hand. It was picked into a grape box, which is a little bit bigger than a prune box. I'm talking grapes and prunes, but a lot of people don't know what grapes and prune boxes are today. So it's a wooden box, and I think roughly 20 inches long by maybe 14 inches wide, more or less. So that it was used annually, year after year after year. And the grapes were picked into those boxes, left in the field. At the end of the day, the grapes were put on a truck and brought to the winery and then crushed. And the crushing was nothing more than taking the grapes and dumping them into a crusher, which would have been a unit, and we can take a look at one outside, that just basically crushed the grapes down into a tank, and then the fermentation took place in that particular tank until the wine was made, and then the pressing was done with a basket press, and we'll look at a basket press also. And then from there into tanks for aging and cleaning and racking, which is basically taking the new wine and letting all the foreign metal. Fermentation is the process of turning the grape juice, sugar, into alcohol. And that's done naturally by yeast. And the yeast actually feed on the sugar in the grape juice. So the sugar content comes down. As the sugar content comes down, the alcohol content goes up. To make a simple story simple, that's exactly what happens until there's no more sugar and you're left with this much alcohol in the wine. That's a simple story. It's a little more technical than that, and there's a lot of other ramifications. But that's basically what's happening in any wine production. Oh, well, automation, yes. I mean, there's a lot of changes that are in the wine business that have taken place in the last, big, huge changes in the last 10 years, 5 years, huge changes. But as far as the bottling is nothing more than, you know, in the old days, the barrel was there, you put a hose in it, and hold the bottle down here, the gallon, here, the hose into the gallon, and fill it up. And then it went into a machine where you had a hose coming into a machine, and you had 6 spouts, and you could put the gallon underneath each spout, and it would fill, and then you take it off to an automated line where it's on a chain conveyor into a filler that rotates so that you can bottle. You know, it's all automation to improve efficiency and quality. And quality's gone a long way in the wine industry, plus. But yeah, automation. My grandparents lived in San Francisco, so they actually didn't move to Morgan Hill until during World War II, beginning of World War II. So he had a caretaker here that would oversee the winery. Not so much, because there really wasn't that much to do. You make wine, you put it in the barrel. I mean, it wasn't like you have every day something to do. When he needed wine, he'd come down, and during the crush, he spent time here. When my father was 13 years old, he got a special driver's license to drive my grandmother from San Francisco here to pick up barrels of wine and take them back to San Francisco. So barrels of wine, you actually went to the liquor store and bought your jug, and they filled it right out of a barrel at the liquor store in past times. And then during Prohibition, a lot of that wine was, of course, illegal, but the French and the Italians didn't stop drinking wine. They just found ways to have that wine available to them. And that wine was basically sold to them in 5-gallon containers. So that's how that was distributed. With the repeal of Prohibition, then the barrels came in where you could deliver barrels to where have you. And then with the influx of, let's say, the glass industry, probably in the, I don't even, it's hard-pressed for me to say when, maybe in the 60s, 50s, then we started going into gallons, and then that took over and the quality, of course, stayed and went up, because a barrel of wine in a liquor store with air in it and there for a week is going to change from when you first got a gallon out of there to when you got the last gallon out of there. Let's go back, you know, in the 60s, 50s, the biggest consumption of wine in the United States was not dry wines, as my grandfather produced. The biggest consumption was sweet wines, ports, cream sherries, and that was what was consumed. When I was in school, it was still said in the late 60s that the American palate is a soda water palate because they drank sweet wines, not dry wines like Europeans, as my grandfather and the rest of California were producing. So the palate has changed, I think, from probably, you know, I think the quality went up, not so much that the palate of the consumer was changing in the early days, but I think the palate of the consumer changed more in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s than it did, say, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Because those people that drank dry wines as we produced in the Santa Clara Valley still drank good wines. But the palate started to change when you saw more influx, more demand for better quality wines. As a more affluent society came in, as people became more educated and wine business changed to reflect that. You know, in the 60s and 70s, you know, you had wines like Valley High, Boone's Farm, Annie Green Springs, California wine coolers, so-called soda water wines. And a lot of those are no longer there, but that educated that generation, my generation, into becoming a wine-consuming generation. And from those wines graduated to where we are today, in a sense. I think what expanded it was the repeal of Prohibition, which said now you can make wine. I mean, I had a conversation with the Harry Giretti, from the Giretti family in Gilroy, that had a winery up until about 1970. And he was probably a little older than my father. My father was born in 1923. So Harry was telling me that he came home from school one day, and the feds had found his dad's winery, and as he was walking home from school, he saw wine running down the creek next to the winery. So they had went in there and they actually destroyed all the wine that was discovered at that particular winery. But so that was a reason to kind of hide and not be out. But when they repealed it, then I think you still saw a resurgence of, well, now I can make it, and now let's get into it. And so then you saw the expansions of wineries. I mean, in Gilroy, you had the Conrado Winery, you had the Bertero Winery, you had the Papani Winery, the Giretti Brothers Winery, Uvis Winery, the Venetia Winery out there in those times. And in Morgan Hill, you had ourselves. With the repeal of Prohibition, you had the Colombano Winery, which was the Petrocetti Winery, started by Camilo Colombano. And so there was it was just the idea that now we can make wine and put up a building, and it's different than today because you were supplying a need. Today, if you start a winery, you're going to put a tasting room up. Well, back then, you pretty much had customers already because you were in the wine business. So, and customers, let's look at back then. Today there are over 3,000 wineries in the state of California. With the repeal of Prohibition, there were probably, I know when I graduated college, there were 175 wineries in California. So it's changed tremendously from what it was then. And wine consumption has changed tremendously. The per capita consumption of wine in the United States is still only 3 gallons per person. But the French and Italian in the 1970s, let's go 1970. In 1970, the average Frenchman and the average Italian drank almost 20 gallons of wine per capita per year, compared to the United States back then, maybe 1 gallon. So you can see that the French and the Italian and the Spanish drank wine. So there was a need for that volume in a sense. And today, the Italians drink 12 gallons, and the French are drinking 11. And the United States is up to 3. So it's changed tremendously as far as the industry, as far as the consumer goes, and what's out there in the marketplace. The Santa Clara Valley was a prime agricultural area. What was it? The Valley of Heart's Delight, where San Jose in spring was just blossoms from cherries, apricots, prunes with a substantial acreage in the valley. Grapes were secondary, probably maybe 10, 20,000 acres back at prime agricultural times. And let's look at the, when we're being in the wine business, we always hear about people visiting our tasting room. Well, I never knew there were any wineries in Santa Clara Valley or in Morgan Hill, but they all know there's wineries in Napa. And I think the issue is here is public relations. You had more money from those particular areas, Napa, Sonoma, that was cultivated into developing the image of being wine country, wine country, wine country. And that created what Napa is today, Napa and Sonoma. But let's not forget that Morgan Hill and the Santa Clara Valley is prime agricultural land. We have the same, we're in the same viticultural area. California is broken up into 5 viticultural areas. We're identical to St. Helena. We have the influence of the coast, as they do. We have the prime land in the valley, as they do. A little bit of different topography. We're a little wider, but we can grow just as good and make just as good a wine here in the Santa Clara Valley as they can in Napa. And I think people need to realize that. And the wine industry has grown tremendously in the state of California. The resurgence, not, Santa Clara Valley basically is Silicon Valley, but that's because the chip industry came in and took the agriculture away from the heritage that we had. I shouldn't say take it away, it changed it. And we live in today's world. Things change constantly, so we can't expect things to stay the same. They never do. But we have a resurgence in viticulture in the state of California and wine. Prime example of that is Monterey County in the 60s when that started to go like crazy and develop. There was no grape acreage in Monterey County. And then, a later picture into the 90s and 80s and 90s, and now is Paso Robles. I think they have over 200 wineries in the Paso Robles area. I graduated Fresno State, and I have to tell you, my wife went to Cal Poly, and so I used to go visit her, and I think there were 3 wineries in Paso Robles at that time. And now it's just another world. So the wine business is a constant evolution of change, and the qualities, I think, if you're in this business, you have to keep your quality the best that you can. And here at Guglielmo, we try to strive to produce the best wines we can from grapes, as much as we can from the Santa Clara Valley. We do buy out grapes from outside the area, but we do try to strive Santa Clara Valley on our label.